Karen Wilkins, the self-appointed president of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association, HOA, stormed out of her immaculate suburban home, her face flushed with indignation. The cause of her outrage: her neighbor, Colonel James Weston, had the audacity to paint his front door a shade of a blue that clashed horribly with the HOA's approved color palette. "This is an outrage," Karen shrieked, her shrill voice piercing the otherwise tranquil morning air. "That man has single-handedly destroyed the aesthetic harmony of our entire neighborhood." Gripping her iPad, Karen furiously typed out an urgent email to the HOA board, demanding that immediate action be taken to rectify the situation. But when her frantic messages went unanswered, she knew drastic measures were required. Without a moment's hesitation, Karen dialed 911, her fingers trembling with righteous indignation. "Hello, yes, this is Karen Wilkins, the president of the Oakwood Estates HOA," she declared, her voice quivering with authority. "I have a serious situation on my hands. One of my neighbors has flagrantly violated our community guidelines, and I need the police to intervene immediately." The operator, clearly caught off guard by the sheer intensity of Karen's demands, tried to calmly explain that a violation of HOA rules did not necessarily warrant a police response. But Karen was having none of it. "This is a matter of national security," she insisted, her eyes darting around the neighborhood as if searching for enemy combatants. "My neighbor is a colonel in the United States Army, and he's clearly trying to undermine the authority of our homeowners association. You need to send the entire police force, the National Guard, and the Pentagon immediately." Stunned silence followed on the other end of the line as the operator struggled to process the absurdity of Karen's claims. Finally, after a long pause, the operator responded, "Mom, I'm sorry, but we can't dispatch the military over a dispute about a paint color. Perhaps you could try speaking with your neighbor first." Karen's face twisted into a mask of outrage. "Speak with him?" she scoffed. "That's out of the question. This man has flagrantly disregarded our community's sacred rules, and I won't rest until he's been brought to justice." With that, Karen ended the call, her mind already racing with her next course of action. She couldn't allow this blatant act of insubordination to go unchallenged. No, she would take matters into her own hands, even if it meant going all the way to the Pentagon itself. Fuming with indignation, Karen Wilkins stormed out of her house, determined to confront her neighbor, Colonel James Weston, about his egregious violation of the Oakwood Estates HOA's color guidelines. As she marched down the pristine sidewalk, her designer heels clicking against the pavement, Karen spotted a group of her fellow HOA members gathered for the weekly neighborhood watch meeting. Without hesitation, she strode up to the group, her iPad clutched tightly in her hands. "Attention, everyone," Karen announced, her voice dripping with a sense of self-importance. "We have a serious situation on our hands, and I need your full cooperation." The other HOA members, who had been casually chatting about the weather and the latest neighborhood gossip, fell silent, their eyes fixed on Karen's agitated demeanor. "One of our own neighbors, Colonel James Weston, has flagrantly disregarded our community's color guidelines by painting his front door a hideous shade of blue," Karen exclaimed, her face contorted with outrage. "This is an unacceptable breach of our homeowners association's rules, and it cannot go unchallenged." The other HOA members exchanged puzzled glances, unsure of how to respond to Karen's impassioned tirade. "We need to take immediate action," Karen continued, her voice rising in pitch. "I have already contacted the police, and they assured me that they will dispatch the entire force, along with the National Guard and the Pentagon, to deal with this crisis." At this, the group erupted in a chorus of confused murmurs and skeptical chuckles. One of the members, a retired school teacher named Mrs. Fitzpatrick, stepped forward, her brow furrowed in concern. "Karen, dear, are you sure you spoke to the police correctly?" she asked gently. "I don't believe they would mobilize the military over a simple matter of home decor. Now would they?" Karen's eyes narrowed, and she straightened her posture, her chin jutting out defiantly. "Of course, I spoke to them correctly," she snapped, "and if you all refuse to take this seriously, then I will have no choice but to handle it myself. This is war, and I intend to win it, no matter the cost." With that, Karen spun on her heel and stormed off, leaving the bewildered HOA members in her wake, wondering just how far their self-appointed president would go to uphold the community's standards. Undeterred by the skepticism of her fellow HOA members, Karen Wilkins marched straight to the front door of Colonel James Weston's home, her resolve unwavering. She had already contacted the authorities, and she was certain that the full might of the military would soon descend upon her hapless neighbor. Raising her fist, Karen rapped sharply on the door, her knuckles against the glossy, offending blue paint. After a brief moment, the door swung open, revealing the tall, imposing figure of Colonel Weston, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Can I help you, Mom?" the colonel asked, his voice tinged with a hint of concern. Karen, unfazed by his polite demeanor, launched into her tirade. "Colonel Weston, I'm here to inform you that your blatant disregard for our HOA's color guidelines is unacceptable," she declared, her fingers tightening around her iPad. "I have already notified the authorities, and they assure me that the full force of the military will be here shortly to address this crisis." The colonel's eyes widened in bewilderment. "The military?" he echoed, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand. What exactly is the nature of this crisis?" "The nature of the crisis is your flagrant violation of our community's standards," Karen exclaimed, her voice rising in pitch. "That hideous blue door of yours is an affront to the aesthetic harmony of our neighborhood, and I won't stand for it." Colonel Weston blinked, his expression shifting from confusion to amusement. "With all due respect, ma'am, I don't believe a dispute over the color of my front door warrants a military intervention," he said, a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Karen's face flushed with indignation. "How dare you mock me, Colonel?" she spat. "This is a matter of national security, and I will not arrest until you have been brought to justice." Before the colonel could respond, the sound of sirens pierced the air, and Karen's eyes lit up with triumph. "Ah, here they come now," she declared, her chest swelling with pride. "Prepare to face the consequences of your actions, Colonel Weston." As the police cars pulled up to the curb, Karen turned to the bewildered colonel, a smug grin spreading across her face. "This is just the beginning," she warned. "You have no idea what you're in for." The sound of screeching tires and blaring sirens filled the air as the police cars pulled up to Colonel Weston's home, their blue and red lights flashing in the midday sun. Karen Wilkins, her face alight with a triumphant grin, watched as the officers sprang from their vehicles, their hands hovering near their holstered weapons. "What's the situation here, ma'am?" one of the officers, a burly man with a thick mustache, demanded as he approached Karen. Ali, the authorities have arrived," Karen exclaimed, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "This man," she said, gesturing toward the bewildered Colonel Weston, "has flagrantly violated the Oakwood Estates HOA's color guidelines by painting his front door a hideous shade of blue. I've already informed you that this is a matter of national security, and I expect you to take immediate action." The officer exchanged a puzzled glance with his colleagues, clearly unsure of how to respond to Karen's dramatic claims. "Ma'am, I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," the officer said, his brow furrowed in confusion. "A violation of HOA rules is not a matter for the police to handle. That's a civil dispute that needs to be resolved between the parties involved." Karen's eyes widened in disbelief, and her grip on her iPad tightened. "What do you mean, a misunderstanding?" she demanded, her voice rising in pitch. "I explicitly told the 911 operator that this was a matter of national security and that the entire military needed to be dispatched." The officer's expression shifted from confusion to mild amusement. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we can't mobilize the military over a paint-colored dispute," he said, his tone measured and patient. "Perhaps you could try speaking with your neighbor and reaching a compromise?" Beside him, Colonel Weston cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on Karen, with a mixture of bewilderment and amusement. "Officer, if I may," he said, his voice calm and measured, "I'm afraid this is all a misunderstanding. I'm simply a retired military officer who has painted his front door a color that doesn't sit well with the HOA president. I'd be more than happy to discuss the matter with her directly." Karen's face flushed with a deep shade of crimson, and she opened her mouth to protest. But the officer raised a hand to silence her. "That seems like a reasonable approach, Colonel," The officer said, nodding approvingly. Mom, I'd suggest you and your neighbor try to work this out amicably. If that fails, you can always bring the matter before the HOA board. But we can't get the military involved, no matter how strongly you feel about the situation. With that, the officers began to turn and head back to their vehicles, leaving a fuming Karen Wilkins and a slightly amused Colonel Weston in their wake. As the police officers retreated, leaving her confrontation with Colonel Weston unresolved, Karen Wilkins felt a surge of frustration and humiliation coursing through her veins. It was simply unacceptable that her dire warnings about a potential national security crisis had been so thoroughly dismissed. Gripping her iPad tightly, Karen paced back and forth on the colonel's front lawn, her mind racing with desperate ideas. She couldn't allow this blatant disregard for the HOA's authority to go unchecked. After all, she was the president, and it was her duty to uphold the community's standards, no matter the cost. Suddenly, a spark of inspiration ignited in Karen's mind, and she halted her pacing, a mischievous glint in her eyes. Quickly, she opened her email and composed a message to the HOA board, outlining the gravity of the situation and imploring them to take immediate action. Colleagues, she typed, her fingers flying across the screen. I regret to inform you that our neighbor, Colonel James Weston, has committed an egregious violation of our community's color guidelines. Not only has he painted his front door a hideous shade of blue, but he has also threatened me with physical violence when I confronted him about this matter. Karen paused, a sly grin spreading across her face as she added the finishing touches to her message. I fear that Colonel Weston's actions may be part of a larger plot to undermine the authority of our Homeowners Association. She continued, given his military background and the potential for this situation to escalate, I urge you to convene an emergency board meeting immediately. We must take decisive action to protect the sanctity of our community and the safety of its residents. With a triumphant flourish, Karen hit the send button, her heart racing with anticipation. Surely, her fellow HOA board members would see the gravity of the situation and take the necessary steps to bring Colonel Weston to heel. Returning her gaze to the colonel, who was watching her with a mix of amusement and concern, Karen felt a surge of confidence. This was her community, and she would stop at nothing to defend its honor, even if it meant resorting to more drastic measures. Mark my words, Colonel Weston, she said, her voice laced with a dangerous edge. This is far from over. The members of the Oakwood Estates HOA board gathered hastily in the community center, their faces etched with a mixture of confusion and concern. They had received an urgent message from their president, Karen Wilkins, detailing a grave situation involving one of their neighbors, Colonel James Weston. As the board members filed into the conference room, they exchanged apprehensive glances, unsure of what to expect. Karen, seated at the head of the table, greeted them with a grim expression, her fingers drumming anxiously on the surface in front of her. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, she began, her voice laced with a sense of gravitas. I'm afraid we have a serious situation on our hands, one that threatens the very fabric of our community. The other board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes fixed on Karen, waiting for her to elaborate. As you know, Colonel James Weston, a retired military officer living in our neighborhood, has flagrantly disregarded our HOA's color guidelines by painting his front door a hideous shade of blue. Karen continued, her brow furrowing with indignation. But what you may not know is that when I confronted him about this violation, he reacted with hostility and even threatened me with physical violence. Gasps of shock and alarm rippled through the room, and several board members exchanged worried glances. Furthermore, Karen pressed on, her voice rising in pitch, I believe that Colonel Weston's actions may be part of a larger plot to undermine the authority of our Homeowners Association. Given his military background, he may have access to resources and connections that could pose a serious threat to the safety and security of our community. The board members fell silent, their faces reflecting a range of emotions, from disbelief to genuine concern. I've already contacted the authorities, but they refuse to take the situation seriously, Karen said, her eyes narrowing. That's why I've called this emergency meeting. We need to take immediate and decisive action to protect our community from this potential crisis. One of the board members, a retired accountant named Mr. Fitzgerald, cleared his throat cautiously. Karen, I'm not sure I understand the full extent of the threat here, he said, his voice tinged with skepticism. Surely, a dispute over a paint color doesn't warrant the kind of response you're suggesting. Karen's eyes flashed with determination. Oh, but it does, Mr. Fitzgerald, she insisted. The sanctity of our community standards is at stake, and we cannot afford to take this lightly. I'm proposing that we take steps to have Colonel Weston removed from the neighborhood, or at the very least, force him to comply with our color guidelines. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions reflecting a range of concerns and uncertainty. As the discussion continued, Karen knew that she would need to pull out all the stops to convince her fellow board members of the gravity of the situation. After all, the future of the Oakwood Estates HOA and her own authority hung in the balance. Frustrated by the HOA board's hesitation to take decisive action against Colonel Weston, Karen Wilkins knew that she needed to pull out all the stops. She couldn't allow this blatant disregard for the community's standards to go unchecked, even if it meant resorting to more unconventional measures. With renewed determination, Karen excused herself from the board meeting, claiming that she needed to gather additional evidence to support her case. In reality, she had a much more audacious plan in mind. Hurrying back to her home, Karen swiftly located the number for the Pentagon's Public Affairs Office. Her fingers trembling with anticipation, she dialed the number and waited with bated breath for someone to answer. After a few rings, a crisp, professional voice greeted her. United States Department of Defense, this is Lieutenant Colonel Harrington speaking. How may I assist you? Karen cleared her throat, summoning her most authoritative tone. Lieutenant Colonel, this is Karen Wilkins, the president of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association. I'm calling to report a matter of urgent national security that requires your immediate attention. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, followed by a cautious response. Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand. How can the Department of Defense assist with the Homeowners Association issue? Undeterred, Karen plowed forward. This is no ordinary HOA matter, Lieutenant Colonel, she insisted, her voice rising in intensity. One of our residents, Colonel James Weston, has flagrantly violated our community's color guidelines by painting his front door a hideous shade of blue. But that's not all. When I confronted him about this, he threatened me with physical violence, and I believe his actions may be part of a larger plot to undermine the authority of our homeowners association. Another pause, this time longer and more pregnant with skepticism. Ma'am, I'm afraid I don't see how a dispute over a paint color could be a matter of national security, the lieutenant colonel replied, his tone polished but firm. Karen's grip on the phone tightened, her knuckles turning white. But don't you see? She exclaimed, her voice bordering on hysteria. Colonel Weston is a retired military officer, and he clearly has the resources and connections to pose a serious threat to our community. We can't allow this kind of blatant disregard for authority to go unchecked. I'm calling on the full might of the United States military to intervene and restore order to our neighborhood. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening, and Karen could practically feel the lieutenant colonel's bewilderment radiating through the receiver. Ma'am, I'm sorry, but I can't dispatch military resources to address a dispute over a paint color, the officer finally responded, his voice tinged with a hint of exasperation. That's simply not how the Department of Defense operates. I'd suggest you try to resolve this matter through the proper channels, such as your local law enforcement or your homeowners association. Karen's heart sank, her last-ditch effort to rally the Pentagon support crumbling around her. Undeterred, she pressed on, her voice laced with desperation. But you don't understand, she pleaded. This is a matter of national security, and if you don't intervene, the consequences could be disastrous. Please, you have to help me. The lieutenant colonel's response was firm and unwavering. I'm sorry, Mom, but I can't help you with this. This is a civil matter that needs to be handled by the appropriate authorities. The Department of Defense cannot get involved. I'd suggest you speak with your local officials or your HOA board to find a resolution. With that, the line went dead, leaving Karen Wilkins standing in her living room, her face flushed with a mixture of fury and defeat. She had played her final card, and it had been resoundingly rejected. Now, she would have to return to the HOA board. Her grand plan in shambles and face the consequences of her actions. Defeated and dejected, Karen Wilkins trudged back to the community center, her shoulders slumped and her expression grim. The phone call to the Pentagon had been a last-ditch effort to rally the full force of the military against her neighbor, Colonel Weston, but it had fallen on deaf ears. As she entered the conference room, all eyes turned to her, the other HOA board members watching her with a mix of curiosity and concern. "Well, Karen, what have you discovered?" Mr. Fitzgerald asked, his brow furrowed in anticipation. Karen took a deep breath, steeling herself for the confrontation that was sure to follow. "I'm afraid my efforts to get the military involved have been unsuccessful," she admitted, her voice laced with disappointment. The board members exchanged puzzled glances, their expressions ranging from confusion to barely contained amusement. "The Pentagon refused to take this matter seriously," Karen continued, her frustration evident in her tone. "They insisted that this is a civil dispute that needs to be handled through proper channels, rather than by deploying the full force of the United States military." A brief silence fell over the room, broken only by the muffled chuckles of a few board members. "Karen, I think it's time we all had a frank discussion about the appropriate scope of our Homeowners Association's authority," Mr. Fitzgerald said, his voice measured and diplomatic. "While we take the maintenance of our community standards very seriously, I don't believe we have the right to involve the military in disputes over paint colors or front door decor." Karen's face flushed with embarrassment, and she averted her gaze, unable to meet the eyes of her fellow board members. "Perhaps we could arrange a mediation session between you and Colonel Weston," Mrs. Fitzpatrick suggested, her tone gentle but firm. "That way, you can both express your concerns and try to find a reasonable compromise." Karen hesitated, her pride still stinging from the rejection she had faced at the Pentagon. But as she looked around the room, she could see the collective disapproval in the eyes of her fellow board members. Reluctantly, she nodded, conceding defeat. "Very well," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll speak with Colonel Weston and see if we can reach an agreement." As the meeting adjourned, Karen couldn't help but feel a sense of disappointment and humiliation. Her grand crusade to defend the community's honor had been thwarted, and she knew that her reputation as the formidable HOA president had been irrevocably tarnished. But deep down, Karen also felt a glimmer of self-reflection. Perhaps she had taken her role as the guardian of Oakwood Estate standards too far, allowing her own ego and sense of importance to cloud her judgment. As she made her way home, Karen resolved to approach the situation with Colonel Weston with more empathy and an open mind, hoping to find a resolution that would satisfy both her own principles and the needs of the broader community. After all, being the president of the HOA was not just about wielding power. It was about fostering a sense of unity and belonging among her neighbors. And Karen knew that if she wanted to truly uphold the values of Oakwood Estates, she would need to learn to compromise, even if it meant swallowing her pride.